Every day, you make decisions: what to buy, who to trust, what to believe. But here's the real question. Are those decisions really yours? Or are they designed? This channel breaks down the psychology behind everything. I'm Shrest, and this is where we decode the world.
All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Because today we're looking at what is honestly the most brutal, unbelievable irony in the entire history of science. We're going to examine one single life that fundamentally shaped the modern world in two completely, terrifyingly opposite directions. It's a story about genius, blind ambition, and the absolute crushing weight of scientific responsibility. I want you to take a second and really think about this number: 50%. Half of the nitrogen currently in your muscles, flowing through your blood, woven into your very DNA, owes its existence to an industrial process invented by one guy. You, me, and billions of other people literally owe the chemical makeup of our bodies to him. And this perfectly captures the wild, jarring juxtaposition of Fritz Haber's life. On one hand, you have his ultimate triumph. He is the literal reason billions of people alive today have enough food on their tables. But then, on the flip side, this exact same man, the guy who fed the world, stood on a battlefield in Belgium in 1915, proudly watched a massive toxic gas attack wipe out enemy lines, and celebrated it. He is universally known as the father of modern chemical warfare. So how on earth does one single human being hold both of these titles? Well, to understand that, we need to go back to his roots. Section 1, the nitrogen problem and a need to belong. Haber was born back in 1868 in Breslau. His mom died early on, and he grew up in a wealthy house that was just completely devoid of warmth. He faced this permanent, icy coldness from his dad. So his entire life basically became this desperate quest for approval. Being born into a Jewish family in an increasingly hostile Germany, he quickly hit a glass ceiling in academia. Jewish scientists were routinely blocked from moving up the ranks. So what did Haber do? He converted to Christianity. Not because he suddenly found religion, but out of pure, burning ambition. He desperately wanted to be accepted as a German first and a scientist second. And honestly, that unyielding need to belong, to prove himself to his father and his country, it drove literally every tragic and triumphant choice he'd ever make. Now, while Haber was out trying to prove his worth, the whole world was facing a massive existential crisis. People called it the nitrogen problem. See, plants absolutely need nitrogen to grow. And sure, 78% of the air we breathe is nitrogen, but it's completely inert. It's locked away. Plants just can't use it. By 1898, a British chemist named William Crookes was sounding the alarm. He warned that natural fertilizers like animal dung and these big saltpeter deposits down in Chile were running dry fast. The global population was about to completely outstrip our food supply, and mass starvation was right around the corner. Humanity desperately needed industrial-scale nitrogen fertilizer. Haber decided he was going to be the guy to figure it out. Which brings us to Section 2, Bread from Air. This is the scientific breakthrough that literally altered human history. Here's the actual chemistry he cracked to create the famous Haber-Bosch process. For years, the greatest minds in chemistry had been trying to force atmospheric nitrogen to react with hydrogen. They all failed. One French chemist even nearly blew up his entire lab trying to do it. But in 1908, Haber, working alongside his student Robert Laracianol, finally cracked the code. By combining the gases, applying a staggering 175 atmospheres of pressure, throwing in an iron catalyst to trigger the reaction, and cranking the heat up to 500 degrees Celsius, boom, they produced ammonia. They literally pulled the building blocks of fertilizer out of thin air. The sheer scale of what Haber pulled off here is just breathtaking. When his process was scaled up for the industry by Carl Bosch, global crop yields doubled, and then they tripled. Think about this. Without the Haber-Bosch process, conservative estimates suggest our planet could only sustainably feed a maximum of 4 billion people. Today, we're sitting at 8 billion. This one single scientific discovery effectively doubled the carrying capacity of the entire Earth. But here is where our explainer takes a really dark turn. Section 3, the father of chemical warfare. By August of 1914, World War I kicks off, and the Western Front quickly turns into this brutal, muddy deadlock of endless trench warfare. Faced with a stalemate, Haber didn't even hesitate. And his mindset was chilling. He basically stated, in peacetime, a scientist belongs to the world. In wartime, to his country. He enthusiastically handed his scientific genius over to the German military. He didn't view poison gas as some horrific last resort. To him, it was just an elegant, scientific solution to break the trench deadlock. But definitely not everyone agreed with him. Contrast his attitude directly with his wife, Clara Immerwahr. Now, Clara wasn't just watching from the sidelines. She was actually the first woman ever to earn a chemistry PhD in Germany. A brilliant scientist in her own right. She watched her husband weaponize the discipline they both loved, and she was absolutely horrified. She begged him to stop, calling his work a perversion of the ideals of science and a sign of barbarity. She really became the ignored moral conscience of this whole story. Haber just completely brushed her off, basically treating her objections like they were treason. And that leads us to this singular, terrifying number, 168. That's the exact number of tons of chlorine gas released from buried cylinders at Ypres on April 22, 1915. Haber had been waiting at the front lines for weeks, just waiting for the wind to shift exactly right. When it finally did, the valves opened and this massive yellow-green cloud drifted slowly across no man's land, right into the Allied trenches. And Haber? He just stood there, smoking his cigar, proudly watching his experiment work. Let these stats sink in for a second. The Allied soldiers had zero protection. Chlorine gas brutally attacks the respiratory system, meaning these men effectively drowned in the open air. That Second Battle of Ypres alone caused roughly 70,000 casualties and over 5,000 deaths. And by the end of the war, chemical warfare, pioneered by the exact same guy who solved the world's fertilizer crisis, resulted in over 1 million casualties and more than 100,000 deaths. This horrific scale of destruction brings us to Section 4, the conscience and the cost. Because the fallout from Haber's success wasn't just global, it was unimaginably personal. Just 10 days after that gas attack, the German military threw this huge party in Berlin to celebrate Haber's promotion. Fritz and Clara fought bitterly that night. We don't know the exact words they exchanged, but we definitely know the outcome. Clara walked out into their garden, took Haber's military pistol, and shot herself in the chest. Tragically, she died right in the arms of their 13-year-old son. And Haber's reaction to his wife's suicide? He was so cold, so totally locked into his mission, that the very next morning, he packed up and left for the Eastern Front to supervise another gas attack against the Russians. Fast forward to 1918. Germany loses the war, but Fritz Haber, he actually wins the Nobel Prize in chemistry. The Nobel Committee tried to defend it, arguing that his fertilizer process had saved way more lives than his poison gas ever took. But the international scientific community was absolutely furious. Allied scientists actually walked out in protest, and newspapers were openly calling the award a disgusting insult to the dead. Which brings us to our final section, the darkest irony. If you thought Fritz Haber's life couldn't possibly get any more complicated, just look at how fast everything completely collapsed. For 15 years after the war, he led one of the most prestigious scientific institutes in Berlin. He had changed his religion, won a Nobel Prize, and literally weaponized chemistry, all for the glory of Germany. But then, 1933 hits. Adolf Hitler's government takes power. And the regime, they didn't care about his patriotism. They didn't care about his Nobel Prize. To them, he was just a Jew. He was ordered to fire all the Jewish staff at his institute. Instead, he finally resigned, fled the very country he had sacrificed his soul for, and a year later, in 1934, he died of a massive heart attack, completely alone in a hotel room in Switzerland. But the nightmare of his legacy didn't stop when he died. Back in the 1920s, researchers working under Haber at his institute had developed a cyanide-based pesticide called Zyklone B, meant for fumigating warehouses. Years after Haber was gone, the Nazi regime took his institute's creation, stripped out the warning scent, and used it as a weapon in the gas chambers of the Holocaust. And in the darkest, most stomach-turning twist of fate you could possibly imagine, many of Haber's own relatives were murdered in the concentration camps using the exact chemistry developed under his leadership. This story of Fritz Haber is wild because it proves that the exact same science, coming from the exact same brilliant mind, can feed billions of people and murder millions. It entirely comes down to the ethics of the human being wielding that knowledge. Clara Immerwahr said no, and she died for her conscience. Fritz Haber said yes, and his chemistry was ultimately turned against his own flesh and blood. So as we wrap up this explainer today, it leaves us with this really profound, uncomfortable question, one that anyone who builds, designs, or discovers things has to face. When someone asks you to use what you know to do something you know is wrong, what are you going to say?